You can create 50 different brands out of the same cultivation facility, but as long as the patient is generally informed, they're going to understand that. So you need to make sure that you're understanding then what that client is looking for, what that patient's looking for. Why do you have a different brand?
Welcome back to High Touch. This is the show where we talk about how cannabis brands are creating real, meaningful experiences for their customers, whether that's in retail, hospitality, product, or culture. We're trying to figure it out what actually connects with people.
Yes, and not just the slick surface level stuff, but what actually makes your dispensary feel good to walk into. What makes someone want to come back? What builds loyalty beyond discounts or text blasts?
And today's guest is someone who's been doing that kind of thinking and building long before most people were even calling the cannabis industry an industry.
Yes, we're talking to Ryan Cook. If you've been in cannabis for a while, you've felt his impact on the industry, whether you knew it or not. He co founded the clinic, the lab, and the bank, which are some of the most respected, storied, award winning operations out of the great state of Colorado.
Yeah, he's been hands-on in cultivation and extraction and retail, compliance, even facility architecture. He helped scale Jushi from a startup to a public company. And now he's advising the next generation of operators at his firm, CFE Consulting.
So, as you might expect, this conversation will cover a lot: brand building through having exemplary operations, the future of genetics in the plant, designing for those high touch experiences, and why those old school values that built the cannabis industry still matter in the industry of today, even though some of the old school operators might not even recognize it. Let's get to the man of the hour, Ryan Cook.
Well, Ryan, welcome to High Touch. We've been really looking forward to this. You played a role in some of the most foundational cannabis companies in the country, the clinic, the bank, the lab. So we're excited to dig into how you think about experience, operations, and brand building. So, I'm hoping to start with a little bit of the origin story here. I know you co-founded the clinic in 2009, but at the time, I imagine it wasn't super obvious that the cannabis industry would become a real regulated industry. At the time, there wasn't a clear roadmap. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate it very much. The reality is my journey, like a lot of us, probably started before 2009 in the cannabis space. And so, luckily for me, I was at the University of Colorado Boulder at the time. Cannabis is really part of the culture here, and I think that's actually why Colorado was as easy to kind of start the program as it was. In 2000, as caregiver licenses came out, these were very, very specific, right? I mean, for individuals that were dealing with some pretty significant issues. And so MS was definitely, one that they had looked at there. And so, we utilized that license there and to learn a lot at the very beginning, right? So it was exciting times, and I think that's kind of how we always knew that cannabis was a part of us. I could not say that in 2000 or 2001, even with caregiver services, that I could have said that by 2025, this is where we would be standing. Obviously, that was a bit of a reach, but it was exciting regardless to be a part of it. And, we got to learn a lot in those early days. And so, yeah, we carried that straight into 2009. I mean, I was then obviously out of college at that point. I graduated in '02 and went on. I've been doing general contracting. I finished with an architecture degree. So, was really using my degree and getting out there. Who knew that I was waiting up until that fateful day where President Obama had made his announcement. And as soon as, that came into effect, we had our first dispensary, I think, open within about 3 weeks of the announcement. And so maybe a little bit longer because we actually then after the fact really we did something that I think was a little bit different at the very beginning. We brought in designers. We actually designed a space. We had custom furniture. We actually had a doctor's office in our dispensary at the time that was permitted. And so, we did have on-site services to be able to get your medical card. So yes, it was exciting. And then out of a cannon at that point, I think from 2009 on, to see the expansion that really took place after the fact.
Well, and I have to imagine it's a huge challenge to be simultaneously operating in this legal gray area, which candidly the whole industry still operates in a legal gray area. But back then it was truly, truly in its earliest infancy phases of even, like you said, the enforcement folks knowing what is and isn't allowed. But balancing that with actually creating a really intentionally designed retail experience, really intentionally designed customer and brand experience that is going to help people to get their first exposure to a commercial cannabis environment. That strikes me as a really significant challenge that basically doubles or triples the amount of work that any other operator selling a similar product would have to do. How did you think about that experiential side? What were the really key factors that drove your decision making about how you were going to create that great customer experience?
It was interesting because I think at the time, most people were going down to the local merchant outfit store, buying a $200 display case, shoving it in there, calling it a day. And that's kind of how they move forward. And, we really intentionally considered the fact that there was a user experience and that we wanted to be able to play to that. And so being that early on, I will admit lime green was our colors, right? I mean, that we did what I think a lot of individuals in the industry did, but I think we also had some really, fun kind of, we had some polycarbonate walls that were backlit in the dispensary. So it, really nice, display cases. The display case we actually built, the very first one, only it had two registers, one on each end, but it was a 12-foot long counter. So 2-foot, counters on the ends for the registers. And then the entire center was a glass case to both look in and look in the front. And obviously that's where we displayed all of our products. I can remember though back to that day, which is the same conversation that I think we're having still in this, dispensary design is whoever decided that the patient has to stand on one side and the bud tender has to stand on the other. Why are we doing this? I recall when we had, probably our third or fourth location that we opened in the Colorado area was in the Highlands neighborhood and a little bit of a trendier neighborhood, up and coming, no question. And this is at the time when you would provide flour directly out of the jar, the deli style kind of option, right? And so, but we had those physical jars on the wall as if you went into a wine store, they were mounted horizontally. Although at the time there was no touching, you could walk up and you could at least, access the jars and look in the side and, say which ones you wanted. We were building a path. We were trying to form, what that journey was going to look like for the patient over a period of time. And I think, there's been a lot of efficiency built into these concepts over time, right? It's how do you efficiently move a patient through a dispensary? Yes, give them a user experience that they still want to come back, but in the same sense, make it happen in a fairly timely manner, right? I mean, that's no question that it would be for any retail environment. Someone's going to look at transaction times and weigh that against what that basket size ultimately looks like. So there's,
Mhm.
of course, going to be an evaluation, along those lines. But I think it was very much about, looking at how do we evolve this to a degree and how do we do it again within the regulatory framework. This wasn't, an Amazon store where you could just pick up and check out on your own. I mean, there was some additional caveats that we had to implement to meet the regulations. And so therefore, design, I think, was kind of forced by, the ultimate program. But it's nice to kind of see that as this evolves, that we'll see people modify and change that.
Mhm.
And, I think even obviously COVID, of course, accelerated that quite a bit. But I think in these environments where you could walk in and in either on your phone or a keypad or something along those lines where those interactions were a little bit different inside the store, of course, is something that has also accelerated what the design concepts ultimately look like. But, at this point, I've had an opportunity being in the industry for as long as I have. I probably have roughly 50 dispensaries or so under my belt. And so we've gotten to evolve that over time and see what different, concepts would look like. In newer markets, I know like when we went into Illinois, our dispensaries had 25 dispensary counters. That's because that's what that volume was ultimately looking like. So I think the designs have to have some level of evolution and potentially, transition that the store can ultimately go through because yeah, it looks a little weird when you walk into a 5,000 square foot dispensary floor and there's two patients on it.
Totally. Is there anything that stands out to you that was particularly constricting in your ability as a designer or architect to kind of create what you wanted? Or did any of those kind of guardrails inspire anything really, innovating or innovative?
100%. And, Colorado is actually a very interesting example, again, because of the fact that regulation sort of forced and led the design. Where at the very beginning, when we went from medical patients into a recreational program as well, they wanted separate entrances and separate dispensaries. So if you thought, hey, this is going to be super easy, we're just going to transition this, and these register counters are going to be medical, and these ones are going, nope, physical walls needed to be put in to be able to divide those individuals so you were not in the same place. And so some of the, regulation, of course, I mean, these are laws that came out, and we've worked with the local governments to be able to modify those over a period of time. But I think, when you went in with a significant expense to be able to develop a concept and how that user experience was ultimately going to work, and then regulations flip it upside down, right? I obviously countless situations that have happened like that. I mean, I think back to the days of just the labeling requirements, let alone physical designs of stores, but how many times that each time that label concept changed, I mean, in a crazy scheme to turn a profit, we ordered things in advance in large volumes, and then they changed the rules on you, and that puts you behind the eight ball, pretty substantially. So from a physical design standpoint, that's obviously a pretty big issue, especially back then. You would have done anything to be able to have that store open as opposed to it sitting there idle for a few more days. I recall, we got very excited about the idea of bringing down, rolling locking doors so that product could stay on the floor due to the amount of time and effort that you had to pull that product out and bring it into the back vault, right? But now I think that concept has been transitioned further, where the vaults are generally directly behind that register counter, so that they're maintaining it, and it's very little trend. So these are small evolutionary steps, I think, in the dispensary. Not just a user experience, conversation, but I think a lot of it has been focused on operational efficiency and operational excellence, right? It's
Mhm.
kind of, how do you run the best dispense? Those are
Mm.
generally the ways in which you do minimizing that kind of a program. And so I'd love to see that level of effort be put into the front of house for, what that interaction looks like with the patient, because day by day, I think we get further and further away from that. Right. And although I think a lot of people were probably under the impression that delivery services were going to solve that problem, I don't necessarily believe that that's the case. I think in a lot of delivery programs, on the implementation, we haven't seen the excitement or the traction that one might assume that you would get. Right. And I think people are still trying to figure out exactly why that is. Is it the model that's different? Is it the fact that the patient ultimately doesn't get to see the product anymore? And what really is that factor? But I think that's something that I'm excited to see as people continue to tackle it, how we improve that. So it's interesting to see kind of how those programs, I think, will continue to change us. Curbside through COVID has now easily led the path for drive-throughs. And I think that the drive-through concept, that does make a lot of sense. If you can drive into a drive-through, does that allow a convenience factor that patients and customers ultimately desire? They're managing a family and an active lifestyle. I mean, there might be reasons as to why a drive-through or a curbside delivery might make more convenience and sense to that individual.
Maybe talk to us a little bit about that regulatory feedback loop, because you obviously just have so much FaceTime with these people who are crafting the laws and making these calls. And I know that in our capacity, we work with a lot of these kind of state bodies, and they never kind of claim to have all the answers. And they kind of often embrace us in a collaborative way to hear our feedback. And I'd love to hear about, in your experience, how you've had the chance to shape some of these decisions being made, and, what that iterative process has looked like, and maybe even point to anything specific that you've had your hands in.
Yeah, obviously, definitely the case. And we've had to obviously work very closely with local regulatory agencies as well as, the federal government up to this point. And now, CFE, we've tackled a lot of projects internationally, which is very exciting as well to be, at ground zero with a country that is now implementing a new regulatory process, and what we were talking about and what we were trying to regulate, and, what the concerns were by the general public. And you think back to Denver time, that, when the first regulations went into effect, the police force bought a massive amount of off-road vehicles because they believed that they were going to be going into a lot of rural areas. They bought multiple paddy wagons because they believed that they were going to be picking up people losing their mind, running naked down the street. But it's difficult when you have to compromise on a very regular basis. And especially when you're not just compromising with the government agency or, generally local sort of children advocacy groups, right? That are usually concerned in certain areas and want to make sure that the language and the packaging and I think that's something that everyone in the industry is fully willing to accept and listen to and work with them through that. And so, those are very interesting conversations of trying to have everyone, reach across this sort of metaphorical aisle and shake hands on what we're trying to do, right? And that's not an easy thing to get to where we all want to be, collectively. And I think I'd love to be a part of that. I mean, I think anyone who wants to be a part of an industry like this, it's a part of it. It's a piece that you have to do. And I think you have to give yourself some time and generally some treasures to be able to make something like this go.
How do you think that has evolved in some of the more recent projects that you've worked on with Jushi now, an MSO going, nationwide with it, trying to make it a real normalized consumer product? Has the strategy or kind of the approach that you've taken changed a little bit to kind of suppress some of those more industrial elements to make it more mass market, or is it still something that you think is resonating with folks?
We sold our consulting company to Jushi in 2019 and then brought my entire operating team on, to oversee operations for them. And I remember sitting down with the CEO and some of the other executives at the time. And, the vision was you are going to be the largest cannabis company in the world, right? And I want you to have that attitude when you're considering design, expansion, innovation, I mean, that's where your head needs to be. And so how do we take these single level cultivations with some had rolling benches. Most people were kind of converting from traditional lighting systems over to LED technologies that were kind of evolving. How are we going to truly have a commercial operating, facility, and what changes have to happen to be able to do that? I think the reality is automation. That's a big way. There has to be some automation that is also ultimately implemented. And the more automation that you implement, the further we get away from product that we all remember coming out of our own individual closet, that you manicured as a monument to yourself, before you smoked that. And now this is in that large of a capacity. There's some different steps that have to go into effect. So we really looked at automation, innovation, right? Multi-level cultivations, tiered cultivations require you to figure out how to access those levels. And if you're going to set a KPI of what your grams per square foot needs to be, however many levels you create in that facility need to be operating at the same level of efficiency, which is challenging, right? I mean, it's much easier to walk into a room and deal with a plant that's on my level than it is for me to access, 20 feet above the ground. You may not be as apt to do that. So the programs and the way in which we manage a facility, all of that has to obviously be built into that program. And we consider that to be our operational excellence programs. And that's really what, CFE Consulting Group does, is that we've brought together, a team of some pretty impressive individuals to be able to help you with each one of those pieces. I mean, GMP standards that we talk about that a lot of people will say, it's ridiculous. It's the FDA. Good manufacturing practices is just that. It teaches you how to actually operate a business good, and how to be sure that when, each process that goes into effect, that you can guarantee and you can project what those KPIs are ultimately going to be. And so it's a critical piece for the way in which a business needs to run and, what implementations had to be done in our standard operating procedures to be able to accommodate SOX compliance and, regular reporting responsibilities and not missing your quarterly earning requirements, right? I mean, these are static things that our shareholders expect.
Absolutely. That really brings a lot together for me. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the challenges of creating something like you built with that vertically integrated clinic, lab, bank, and all of those challenges that you overcame to do that. How does that translate into a better customer experience, a better brand, a better outcome from a business perspective? I think that the potential for reducing costs by taking some of these intermediaries out, obviously that, is a really big one, but, I'd love to hear from your perspective, how does the customer experience that on the other side of making all of those really challenging changes that, you and CFE are doing so much work on?
a lot of those modifications of a vertically integrated business are solely based on making the business efficient, making the business more profitable and, run better. When the reality, I agree with you. I mean, the user experience is also going through a transition while they experience your growth. And so, I think for us, we all started at the clinic together. We developed those other brands of the lab and the bank. We brought all of that over to Jushi. We operated Jushi for the last 6 years as an operating team, and then have moved to CFE together as well to continue to do this. And so, each time you learn a little bit that obviously helps you transition and bring that to the next one, no question. So I think, where we learned at the very beginning, I mean, one, the transition of those organizations in the first place were extremely dependent and sort of a demand that the industry required. I think for a patient, it was very understandable that if they were to come in and they picked up some flour, or they picked up a concentrate or a vape or some gummies, and it said the clinic on it, and they knew that the clinic grew that, and the clinic was the dispensary as to where they made those purchases, it seemed to make sense. You grew a bond and a relationship with the brand that you could trust them, and no different than any brand loyalty that we see in any industry, right? The problem was that you were needing to be able to wholesale that product as well. And I think our competitors would say, yes, I love the clinic. It's great. No interest in putting your product on our shelves. Okay. I by no means am going to have one of my patients then get excited and think, why don't I just go to the clinic? I bet you I can buy it cheaper over there. That really created this new requirement for us to really separate brands. But in that separation, it also allowed you essentially to run separate P&Ls. And when you can kind of start running separate P&Ls like that on these brands, it allows you to think about the marketing a little bit differently. It's not in a vertically integrated business where we're just saying we're marketing to everybody and what we're marketing is cannabis. Now we're getting very specific. We're zeroing in on what those patients and customers are ultimately after. They're tying themselves to, I'm a concentrate user, I'm an edible user, I'm a flower person, and they're buying into those brands and they're accepting that. And so that brand loyalty then can happen because now they can purchase the bank's flower at the clinic, but they could also purchase it at Native Roots. They could also purchase it at whatever other location, obviously, that they were intending to go to. And so, for us, I think that was a smart thing. We saw this split happen between companies deciding to be mono brands and companies deciding to actually bring other product in and start to act like a traditional 7-Eleven. A lot of those, a lot of brands are actually owned by, certain companies like that, right? And they will rebrand or remarket those materials within their store to provide consumer choice, which is critically important. And I think all of us understand that. What I think, though, is that the consumer also has a general understanding of what's happening there, right? I mean, because of our labeling requirements, there is license numbers on these. So you can create 50 different brands out of the same cultivation facility, but as long as the patient is generally informed, they're going to understand that. So you need to make sure that you're understanding then what that client is looking for, what that patient's looking for. Why do you have a different brand? Is it managed differently in your facility? Is it all hand done, no automation whatsoever? This is top colas only? Is it a potency number that we're shooting for? What is the differentiation between that product and the other product that somebody's purchasing on that shelf? So that was a lot, I think, of developing these brands and how that would ultimately be brought to larger MSOs. I think when you get to a larger MSO, the advantage is larger budgets allow you to be able to create more brands. And then also to be able to go in and truly market those brands and the individual products very specifically, whereas you couldn't when you were just kind of throwing it at the wall to see what would stick, And so I think you can start to hear the customer more and you can start to use that feedback more. And therefore, I think that's the modifications that we'll see. You may not have to throw so much at the wall because you understand your customer more.
For sure. And you kind of alluded to it, but on that topic of, brand building and storytelling, something that's so important in this industry is genetics and IP, and something that I was just reading that you've shared previously about F1 hybrids. And you kind of mentioned that you think that that's one of the most innovative things happening in cannabis right now. So for people that aren't so deep in cultivation, tell us a little bit about F1 hybrids and what the big unlock is there.
I'm glad you brought it up because I think in cannabis in general, we're always looking for innovative ideas, right? And I've been very impressed. There's a group out there, Phylos. Phylos has been around now since about 2014, and they've created some very exciting genetics. And these genetics are the F1 hybrids. And F1 hybrids, and I think this is where what's exciting to me, from 1830 to 1930 in the United States, when we grew corn or wheat, we harvested at 20 bushels per acre. For 100 years, they harvested at 20 bushels per acre. Roughly in the 1930s, a little bit before that, they started to introduce F1 hybrid genetics, right? And what those were was stabilized genetics for that particular plant. And we have seen roughly, I would say, 800 to 1,000% increase in yield from 1930 till now. And so there's a reason why, and it's that we have genetically understood what these plants are. Now, we've all been, classically pheno hunting for different cannabis genetics, and we love talking about that. I think the biggest issue for me in large production facilities is that pheno hunting changes my expected yield is, right? If I put R&D inside of a room that I'm expecting to hit 75 grams a square foot, I am not shooting for 74 or 73. We are shooting for 75 grams a square foot and above. That's the KPI. That's what the objective is. If I modify that and in a R&D, program, I end up with 50 grams, that hurts our bottom line and it hurts our shareholders. And therefore, it's not an option. And so we look at, ways in which to make sure that we are always going to achieve the KPIs that we shoot for. So I kept looking in genetics and trying to figure out what opportunities there really were. So we were selling genetics here in the States and we were super proud of that. But you did not have 20 years of genetic stabilization. You had essentially pollen chucking, right? And then doing a pheno hunt off of that to be able to find a genetic that we were excited about. That takes some time, not nearly as long as what I'm talking about in the development of F1 hybrids, but those were our humble beginnings. And that's where I think a lot of the exciting genetics that we spoke today came from, right? Was from those types of pheno hunts. To me, it's the evolution of our industry. It is where we're headed. So I'm very excited about it. I'm loving seeing what Phylos is continuing to do. Every quarter, they're putting out about 4 to 6 new genetics. So very exciting. And some of the innovative things, like when you kind of think about being able to find markers in genetics, like what would be interesting, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Super cool stuff, man. This is awesome. Give us a prediction for the next 5, 10 years in the cannabis industry. You're so deep in it and so many different elements here. I'd love to hear some of your, thoughts on what we can expect from a regulatory standpoint or just an overall kind of, commercial landscape and trajectory.
In the domestic market here in the United States, I mean, we've seen consolidation over the years, right? Because I think the reality is that people had a relationship with that particular name and that dispensary, and individuals are concerned and scared about making those modifications. So although now, companies are swallowing up larger numbers of these dispensaries, you kind of still see that brand recognition, throughout these markets. So, I think we'll obviously continue to see consolidation until we can see some type of federalization of this program where we will recognize that there are certain areas of this country that are much more beneficial to be growing cannabis in than in others. And we're going to have to see how that changes.
Awesome. Brian Cook is the co-founder of the Clinic, the Lab, and the Bank, 3 foundational cannabis brands that helped set the standard for retail, extraction, and genetics. He's led operations at every level of the industry, from building award-winning dispensaries to scaling a national MSO. Today, Ryan runs CFE Consulting, helping cannabis businesses design smarter, grow faster, and operate with intention. Thank you for joining us, Ryan. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. It was great to have some time with you guys. I appreciate it. And hopefully, if anybody is looking for assistance out there as well, CFEconsultinggroup.com, you can find us there. And we've got a team of really amazing subject matter experts in each division of the industry. So we look forward to being able to support you.
I've met a lot of people in cannabis, and Ryan has proven to me you really know your stuff. So I would recommend anybody out there reach out to CFE. Thanks so much.
Thank you, guys. You have a good one, okay?
You too.